2,000 adults, which just ran. The first results were the ones I showed you earlier. That was a little teaser from it about whether or not climate change was affecting this election. There will be a full rollout of the analysis. It was a very long. It's an hour long. It takes 2 chunks to get an hour long. One of the most exhaustive surveys yet done on climate change, and all those results will come out in January. So in time to help to shape the priorities we hope of the next administration. And I think that is the kind of the model, that's the kind of scope we need to think about, the kind of tools that will be necessary to do that. And that can be done by pollsters like Ed and Tony, right, by themselves. But you can sort of see then why here the moral dimensions, especially given that this is a moral framework, is aided by the direct input, right, of ethicists as well. Here's a hurdle, though, I will tell you, and this is one piece of data that we didn't release in the initial press release on this. Because it's frightening, quite frankly. And what I want you to look at is how much people trust or distrust John McCain as a source of information about global warming. Among the people who are going to vote for him, right, almost 50% strongly distrust McCain on climate change. Over 50% somewhat distrust McCain on climate change. Why is that? Why is it that his supporters distrust him as a source of information on climate change? Because he says it's real, and because he wants to do something about it, right? So that is, I think, and it gives you a crystallization of the part of the electorate that we really have to focus on and work on in addressing this question in some way. So thanks very much, and let's have some questions.
And there's also refreshments, so you can do both at the same time.
I was very interested in your suggestions about from the polling and the idea of saying different things to different audiences, but it raised some questions in my mind. It sounds a lot like market research in which people go out and find out what to say to different kinds of people, different kind of product that they want to sell. And so there's a question about it's an ethical question also, I guess, about market research and whether it really is all right to poll people to get information to then use to influence them. And there's the question of whether this strategy could be turned against you in the long run when it becomes public that that's what you're doing. And it reminds me of one of the head scientists for the Nature Conservancy told me that the Nature Conservancy is respected and listened to in Congress because they are not seen as an advocacy group, but they're seen as a scientific group that simply states the scientific facts. And so the question of if you go from simply stating scientific facts to something that can seem to be manipulative, will that undercut you in the end?
I mean, that's an empirical question. I mean, and we'll sort of see. But I don't think it will. Can people use this information for bad reasons? Absolutely. Right. This is public data, and it could be used for bad purposes. For example, that's one of the examples I was talking about with folks earlier this evening. I've been tracking very closely how a lot of the shops in D.C. that used to be in the business of climate skepticism, like the American Enterprise Institute, and that was their job to go out there and sort of raise what were a series of really bad manipulative questions about dispute among scientists that really did not exist, at least not among the serious scientists working on this issue, have transformed themselves into proponents of a carbon tax. So rather than doing a national cap and trade system, right, we come up with a cap, we sort of do an auction of permits that every polluting firm can have, and then we sort of allow them to trade those permits so some can pollute more if they can't, come into compliance and bring down their CO2 load. Versus we just have a straight across tax, right? There's only so much CO2 you're allowed to emit, and if you go over that, then there's a charge for it, right? Both are ways of putting a price on carbon, which is incredibly important in order to spur the research and technology, which is going to eventually give us the way to get out of this problem, to create the technology which will, give us the amount of energy we need without it being carbon energy. The American Enterprise Institute is now a vocal proponent of a carbon tax. The reason is not because, like I do, think that, in fact, it's a much more efficient way of tackling this problem than a cap-and-trade system. Although they will say that, the reason that they're endorsing a carbon tax is because of some of that information I showed you earlier, the first graph I showed you, which is people support all kinds of ways to take on this problem except a tax. And so the reason they propose a carbon tax now is because if they can get that to be the next major piece of legislation, it will get shot down, right? And they get that from the data. So the data's out there, and people can do bad things with it. And the best that I can do is then prove that they are, in fact, doing bad things. They're lying about their support of a carbon tax. They really don't want one, right? And then make that argument, track that argument, and then make an argument against them. But there's another part of your question, which is just, is what I'm doing, is there kind of a dishonest bit of it? And I don't think so. It will, and this is the uncomfortable moment in this kind of way of doing philosophy for most philosophers, is it does smack of sophistry. And our story about why philosophers are philosophers and not some other field is because of the story that we have of how Socrates was confronting these manipulators of knowledge and learning in the ancient Greek world. But I don't think it is, in the same way that I don't think that when a clinical bioethicist goes into a hospital room and you have to make a decision about disconnecting life support, you don't go in with a top-down argument about, well, here's what you ought to do because my research, in the moral theory tells me that this is the right thing to do. You have a view about the right thing to do, what to do is, when you go into the room, right? And I think like one common view that many bioethicists would have is that you don't just continue to keep people on life support when there is no hope, once you've gotten brain death or something like that. But what you do is you help people to make what you think is the most informed moral decision that they can, based on the information you can get from them, what is important to them, and what is important to they think would be important to the person who they're making a decision for, where some directive has not been antecedently provided. And that's what we're doing on just a much bigger scale, is getting that baseline information of what's important to people and how that may correlate. We have a considered moral view that this is a problem and that we have a moral responsibility to solve in a particularly robust way, right? But I do want to find out how people respond to particular kinds of arguments. And the version, this is a much more complicated version of an argument that I used to make with respect to environmental claims in general as a form of my environmental pragmatism. One of the most important ways in which people understand their moral obligations to the environment is through their religion, right? So if I'm asked to go talk to a church group about, say, designation of a new national park, something that I've got reasons to believe is very important from the perspective of maximizing biodiversity or as a conservation target, then I want to come informed with that kind of language, but I also want to come informed with an argument about, in the Christian case, why some form of Christian stewardship does give you a very good reason for, embracing a more robust position on the environment. This is exactly the kind of approach that was used to try to convince Christian evangelicals to lobby the Bush administration, right? Not to basically oppose doing something on climate change, to give up their skepticism point. And I think that's fair. It would be unfair for me to sort of say something false, like, Jesus sent me here today to tell you to do something on climate change, because he didn't. Right, but I think it's fair game to say this is important to you, and I know this is important to you from some process I have of gathering information, and then I'm going to use that information to make the best case I can consistent with what's important to you. Yeah.
I think this is a follow-up question.
Yeah.
It does seem to me that you've already got the moral answer. So I don't see this as quite moral philosophy. It seems to me the answer is we've got to cut down on carbon emissions, and now it is a matter of persuading the public to come along. So it does feel to me like this example is more about rhetoric and persuasion, and not necessarily immoral,
That's okay.
but not necessarily philosophical either. Rather, it seems to me the parallel with bioethics would be, for example, your thoughts on how to reach a decision about, say, the Amazon rainforest, or how to reach a decision about whether to allow more hog confinement in Iowa.
Right.
That seems to me to be more of a clinical climate ethicist job than when you've already got a foregone conclusion. Now you just have to bring the public along, and we're just going to tweak it by, well, just sort of sending out messages and getting feedback. I think this gentleman has a good point. It does feel more like something pollsters and manipulators and rhetoricians are concerned with than ethicists.
It's good. It's a very fair critique. Let me. I think there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. There are some ways that I don't actually believe are true, because there are sort of Darwinians in moral theory who say, like, no, this is it, right? This is actually real moral philosophy, because it's all about sort of like the truth of it is sort of these attitudes as they're expressed, and I think that's not right. But go back to like if the strongest determiner for public attitudes, as far as we can tell, and until it's proven otherwise, I might change my view on this if this is proven otherwise, is a moral framework, right? To that extent, the claim to push people off the dot for whatever reason, to get beyond the noise that's been created out there, so they're not as concerned about this issue as they should be, or they have a view that I think leads them to a bad conclusion, such as we should accept massive inequality in the way we respond to this problem, means that you have to make an argument about starting from that moral viewpoint to another viewpoint using a moral argument. Now, of course, you don't have to be a philosopher to make a moral argument, right? But I'd rather have philosophers crafting those arguments than people who have no interest in the rigor or the truth of the matter, right? Because the difference, I think, between me and the guys from American Enterprise Institute is that I think there's something wrong with misrepresenting your position, right? And they don't. And so I think the role, and this is a project that involves a lot of polling and a lot of marketing and a lot of other kinds of things, which is stuff that I'm not trained in. But I'd rather that the person representing the ethical side, of this question at the table is actually an ethicist, right? Rather than someone who only thinks that ethics is a way you can manipulate other people, and I think that would be a contradictory position. Right?
I want to ask about, I think as a follow-up to this, with something that seems sort of like a significant disanalogy then between clinical bioethics and this clinical approach to environmental ethics. And so when you described clinical bioethics, you said theory goes out the window. But it seems like the model you're proposing here for clinical environmental ethics is not that theory goes out the window. In fact, it's that theory now gets used in some way to craft an argument in response to these numbers. So it seems like clinical bioethics is, well, there's hopefully a sort of manipulative element that's lacking that we're worried about. That seems to be the source of our worry here about the environmental side. But you said the theory is now being turned into a tool in the account you're proposing. And I'm not a bioethicist, a clinical bioethicist in particular, so I don't know if that happened, but it seems like there's a difference then if theory seems to be it.
Yes, that's really good. That's very helpful. I mean, if we're using theory more as a tool than the clinical bioethicists are, then I think that's great, because that makes us sound sort of more attuned to the theory and more respectable and less the shysters, right, than they are, which is one of the things that people do actually accuse clinical bioethicists of sometimes doing, I think mostly unfairly. And also maybe the case that Marino was being a little bit, over the top in that particular idea. It goes out the window. Well, it doesn't completely go out the window insofar as your training doesn't like evacuate your head, when you're in that kind of situation, no matter how temporally constrained it is. But the way that I sort of think of it, to me, one of the most important and overlooked areas of environmental ethics has been moral motivation, right? And I think claims about what morally motivates people are moral theories, right? Now, I'm not going to say that they're any better, right, than other kinds of moral theories that don't include that kind of, that component. And that's one of the reasons I'm more drawn, for example, to virtue theories and environmental ethics than I am of other kinds of theories. But I think that there's a case to be made that they can be more important under certain circumstances. So in the past, I've sort of said environmental ethicists in general have to sort of pay attention to the question of what arguments morally motivate people to change their action, insofar as we're really temporally constrained on coming up with a solution to these problems. And that was before I even considered thinking about climate change as an example of this. And now you sort of look at what the best scientists are saying, and I think we're even more constrained than I'd been sort of thinking before. And that really, I think, makes the question of moral motivation important. And insofar as that, if then it bothers you that if that still rubs against the people's philosophical intuitions, it seems to me that at the very least, this kind of exercise produces good data, right, that one can use when talking about motivations. Okay.
I'm going to make a suggestion about this.
Good.
It seems to me that one of the things you might discover in going through this is that some of the arguments, I think you will discover it, some of the arguments that are most effective at changing people's views are arguments that we would recognize as bamboozlement,
Yep.
right? I think, look at political ads, various different political ads. It turns out that a lot of the most effective ones aren't the ones that are appropriately drawing on people's moral sensibilities or making moral arguments based on people's underlying highest moral priorities or values. And you don't want to be involved in that. I hear in what you're saying that you don't want to be involved in that for moral reasons. So I think that what underlies this is not just a view about which arguments are most efficacious in changing people's view. I think I'm suspecting you of having an underlying theory of discourse, right?
Wow.
It might be something as simple as a theory about which forms of interaction constitute bamboozlement, and which constitute, honest. What I want to see when bioethicists interact with people in a clinical setting, I want to see people honestly interacting, honestly drawing on people's values and helping other people to think through their issues. And I think that's different from trying to get people to, to come to my view no matter what argument I might be able to use. Making that distinction between bamboozlement and however you want to describe that appropriate practice, I think is a theory of discourse. So I think you may be embedded in theory in a way that you might not be acknowledging.
Okay.
So I want to hear
All
what you
right.
think.
Well, I accept that. The way that I've been thinking about it is it's just compatible with and not as deep as that comment. Is I'm really interested in what kind of claims and arguments and different kinds of issues get people to take a longer term view as opposed to just simply responding to the moment, right? And the example that haunts me, I think that what the Europeans have done, for example, with respect to genetically modified foods, is the right position, but they did it for the wrong reasons. So they're much more, I think, appropriately skeptical of some of the issues involving genetically modified foods. But it was largely done, I would argue, because of the ability of food activists and environmentalists to manipulate both the hoof and mouth scare and mad cow disease, which had nothing to do with genetically modified foods, to manipulate those to create an atmosphere of distrust, right, of regulatory science in places like Great Britain, which then put pressure on the EU for the moratorium and like all that kind of stuff. So what are the arguments that not only get people to, the bamboozlement argument that might get you the instantaneous, we think you should sign the next Copenhagen Treaty, if it doesn't have legs to get people to really think about the fact that they have real moral responsibilities in the face of this problem, I think is, similarly not a good way of going, because it's not stable. It's just not a stable answer, and I think it's also morally problematic. But I like that suggestion.
Can I just have one follow-up?
Absolutely.
Because it seems to me that one of the things you're doing with this platform, this web platform you've been built for 5 years, is you're trying to build trust in the community of people that is involved in
That
this
answer it.
project. And having a theory about bamboozlement,
Mhm.
might, and having which forms of discourse are bamboozlement, or systematically taking advantage of what I think are human propensities, systematic human propensities to accept bad inferences in certain cases.
Mhm.
I think that might increase trust
Mhm.
if you have a section that specifically addresses that issue.
Mhm.
I have a somewhat different question. Quite a while ago, The Economist magazine had a cover article that basically was, we can pollute if we can afford it. Rich countries could pollute in poor countries. And it was more about environmental damage and having factories that don't respect health regulations and safety regulations. Is the climate harder to do that with? Is it harder to divide the climate up? I mean, I noticed that it will affect other people more than us. It had about a 40% response rate. So it seems that people can do it some, but is it a little harder to do that with climate than it is with a polluting factory? I mean,
Yeah.
so how does that affect the whole discussion, I guess, is what I'm wondering. Does it make it easier to make climate something of concern? Is it harder to push it onto a different island far away?
It's very complicated. It's very difficult to answer that question in some space because it gets into there's so many different ways, things that it brings up. But it's good because it's not like point source pollution, in the sense that you just, like I said before, you don't just sort of put a hole over a drain or something and you're done, because whatever we put up there is affecting everyone more or less equally, except there's a fundamental inequality which has to do with the fact that the poles will get have a disproportionate change over the areas that are closer to the equator, right? Because of the temperature problem. And then there's a whole resilience problem on top of this. So it might be easier for us to, in the short term, react, and in the longer term, adapt to, say, a 1 centigrade rise in global mean temperature, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 4, or worst case scenario, a 5 to 7, because of the wealth that we already have. So there are these built-in inequalities in that respect as well. And I think part of the reason that people, one of the things that we're hoping to do with this new study is sort of get behind those numbers that we have. Why is it that people think that the impacts are going to really be worse for people further away than not in their own community, right? Is it just simply a function of you're trying to do a national poll, and of course, we're not talking only to people in New Orleans who have had arguably a direct experience, or one that they might attribute as a direct cause. Or it can be something more complicated, and it might have to be that sort of just the sense of, I think appropriately and probably rightly, this sense of resilience, one place or another. But then on top of that, that's the kind of place where I really want to test some moral arguments. And Clark has heard me make this argument before. What are the analogies that get us to think about, get us off the dime on this notion of there will be winners and losers in climate change? Because I think it's a deeply immoral claim, but people don't really recognize it as such. So the analogy that I've run is like, that would be like saying there are winners and losers in the global trade in human organs. So it just so happens to be that some people in Bangladesh are so impoverished they have no choice but to sell one of their kidneys on the market. And we relatively wealthy people, things never get that bad, and so we can afford to live unhealthier lifestyles because we can get these organs from other places, and that would be an obscene, perverse claim. But I think that's kind of like, given that we are helping to cause, the carbon that's going to hurt the sub-Saharan Africa is not just their carbon, it's our carbon as well, and disproportionately our carbon, given global population, I think means that we're in fact putting them in that situation where they're something comparable to the person who has to sell their organs, and so to take advantage of that seems perverse, right?
You don't have to answer this question if you don't want to. I wouldn't go to New York and answer a question about how bad the Yankees suck, but do you have anything to say about climate ethics and biofuels?
I will defer to my colleague Clark Wolf for answers on that question. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly corn ethanol. We all have to ask some deep questions about whether that's the right way to go, and then beyond that, how far we want to go with respect to biofuels. So now I will sort of skirt the question now as I've dumped it off to Clark, but I will say the idea that there's a one fuel solution to this is just so completely false. It's not even funny. And the best way of thinking about it is current global consumption of power is about 14 terawatts, 14 billion light bulbs. And if we were to look at a pretty modest increase, but tracking population and tracking development in developing countries like China and India, and we get to 2050, and then we're looking at 25 terawatts of energy. And so the challenge becomes, how do you generate 25 terawatts of energy without carbon, right? And that is a really big problem. And there's a guy, David Nocera has an energy lab at MIT, has gone through and sort of crunched numbers on this, and you could talk about, if we made all plant matter in the globe, right, turned all that into biofuels, we don't get there. We only get a certain small portion. If we build a new nuclear plant like every 10 days, which is impossible, we don't get there. If we dam half the rivers in the world, we don't get there. Like all these different ways in which none of these come even close to giving us some kind of a large-scale solution to the problem of generating that much electricity without carbon, except for solar, but not current solar. It's going to be a very different kind of solar than anything we see now, and that's just based on the fact that you get like 100 terawatts of energy from the sun hitting the planet at any given moment. How do you capture that and turn that into some kind of usable energy? And the best guess is it's going to be some kind of weird synthetic biology, nanotechnology kind of thing where you're creating artificial photosynthesis machines, man-made machines that can do photosynthesis and then convert that into energy. And that seems to be the best case scenario for getting that much power without carbon. Otherwise, there's no more food because we've turned everything into biofuels, and we've got nuclear power everywhere, and birds are striking windmills left and right, and none of those seem as goers at all. So that's what. Whenever I meet someone I've got the solution, it's nuclear power, or I've got the solution, biofuels, like, you ain't got nothing, really, because no one has the solution, short of the people who invent this technology that doesn't exist yet.
I'm very intrigued by your suggestion of the clinical climate change ethics, but in bioethics, I'm on the hospital ethics committee,
Mm-hmm.
and I do a little bit of this, and they called me up and invited me to come, and the doctors and all other healthcare personnel really want to figure out what's the right thing to do in these situations, and the patients and the families and the hospitals, everybody's really interested in doing that. And so far, no senator or anybody has called me up and said, please come and
Right.
give us some advice on how we might do this. It seems to me that there's so much economically at stake there, and anything I might have to say might be like totally expensive to everybody or something. I mean, do you really think that this could happen on a practical level? Don't you think there's maybe a fundamental difference between the situation we have in clinical bioethics and a situation we have here?
I mean, do I think it's the case that we could actually develop some kind of capacity to actually make some kind of difference? Yeah, I do. I really do. And again, it's because this language of morality just is diffuse throughout. I mean, it's just all through and through, suffused throughout, right? All discussions of climate change. And I mean, I think maybe some of the origins that I had of this was like shortly before, in August 2001, there were hearings on stem cell research in the U.S. Senate, and right around when Bush was thinking about having this moratorium on stem cell research, back before he had other things to do, right? And then there was a front page piece in the New York Times about Glenn McGee, who's a bioethicist who was then at Penn, who's now at SUNY Albany, and some other bioethicists testifying before the Senate on this bill. And it was really interesting, and it was covered by a Times reporter in New York named Cheryl Gay Stolberg, who's a very good, covers the Hill for the New York Times. She did a great job of covering that. The following Sunday, this was like on a Monday, the story came out. The following Sunday, she had a piece in the Sunday Times opinion section. The piece basically said this: who are all these bioethicists anyway, right? And what do they know about what's right and wrong? I mean, my well-meaning grandmother, and this is a quote right from the piece, my well-meaning grandmother knows as much about ethics as these pointy-headed academics, right? So, I wrote a letter. I wrote a letter to the editor. But first, I tried to write a column, an editorial, about, well, there might be some difference between your well-meaning grandmother who has no training in ethics and what these guys do, right? And of course, it got shut down. Then I tried to make a letter to the editor. They didn't take his letter to the editor, and so then I just sort of did this. I just looked up Cheryl Gay Stolberg's, email address, and I sent it to her. I said, look, here's what I think is the problem. And to her credit, she wrote me back, and we started this exchange of stuff. And it did show me that, it's not, if you can get people to really listen, if you can communicate in an effective way what it looks like, the thing that, the work that ethicists and philosophers do could bring to this kind of claim when you've got an opening to talk about something in a moral issue and how it might get you a better, right, way of just framing these problems, let alone solving these problems, then I think it can be done. And could it be done in this forum? I think it could. It might not be done by trained philosophers, right? It might be done by the really good students in natural resources management and environmental studies and environmental sciences for whom we provide some really, really good advanced work, right, in ethics that is designed not only to sort of help them to take the next step forward to become the people on the ground who are doing this stuff in these kinds of arenas like the UN process or coming very shortly, to our Congress, but also be coupled with ways of teaching them how to communicate, right, this stuff to broader audiences, which we are not the best trained to do. But that's where, I'm in the process right now. This is a progress report, and if you guys decide to bring me back in a few years, I'll sort of tell you what happened in my own story. But this is I'm in the process of kind of retraining myself to learn how to talk to, these broader audiences in an effective way, which is extremely difficult, right? And it may just be that the best that we're going to do is hopefully get the sympathetic ear of the folks who will be able to do that communication.
And